Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with episode 64, the fifth in my mini-series on Krishnadevaraya. In the last episode, we looked at Krishnadeva's decision to treat the Portuguese not as a threat, but as trading partners. And that choice secured him a steady supply of Arabian and Persian war horses. But having that supply of war horses also meant that he could now embark on his serious military campaign towards the east. He was done defending his land against the biggest enemy, the Gajapatis of Odisha. He needed to attack them. So today we will follow him as he turned east. From 1513, Krishnadeva embarked on what would become his longest and most arduous campaign. It was the contest that would last 6 years and would decide who controlled Andhra, the forts, the river crossings, and importantly, the fertile deltas of the Krishna and Godavari. But before I take you down that road, I must first thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. By 1509, the rivalry between Vijayanagara and the Gajapatis had already hardened into a frontier war. The Gajapatis had expanded steadily southward since the late 14th century, first under Kapilendra Deva and then under Purushotama Deva. They had seized Udayagiri and Kondavidu, carved out much of coastal Andhra, and planted their authority as far inwards as Rajamandri. Their capital at Cuttack may have been a distance away, but their grip on the Krishna-Godavari country was uncomfortably strong for Vijayanagara. So they needed to lose them. But this was not the first time Vijayanagara had tried to dislodge them. In 1491, Saluba Narasimha fought bitterly to defend Udayagiri that he had taken from them earlier. He managed some temporary gains, but this second battle of Udayagiri resulted in his capture, a negotiated release, and even before he got home, his death. I have covered this in a previous episode. That history is both important and interesting, so if you haven't heard those episodes, do try to. Now, in short, the lines of confrontation were therefore already drawn between the two empires when Krishnadeva came to power. For Vijayanagara, the stakes in Andhra went beyond mere territory and political chest-thumping. The Krishna and Godavari deltas were some of the most fertile regions in India. Seasonal floods renewed the soil. Irrigation tanks and canals, many built under the Reddy and Gajapati rules, had turned the countryside into a pretty patchwork of paddy fields. The rice harvests were immense, sustaining not just peasants, but armies, temples, and urban markets. Revenue from these lands flowed to whichever ruler held them, making them a treasury in grain. And then there was the sea. The ports of Coromandel, such as Masulipattnam, connected the Deccan to the Bay of Bengal. Through this they exported rice, cotton, textiles, indigo, and in return they brought animals, horses mainly, copper, and luxury goods. By the early 16th century, the horse trade was especially critical. Arabian and Persian breeds arrived not only on the Konkan coast, which was now dominated by the Portuguese, but also through Coromandel, at ports that were already equipped to handle large animals like elephants. Controlling those ports meant controlling a second artery of supply, ergo less dependence on the Portuguese. So losing Andhra to the Gajapatis had meant that Vijayanagara was shut out of those revenues and supplies, and this was not an option. Regaining it would give Krishnadeva strategic depth. Now, the Gajapati king at this time, in the early 16th century, was Prataparudra Deva. He was no minor opponent. His realm stretched from Bengal to the Godavari. In Andhra, his generals and relatives held the great forts. It was a very well-administered kingdom. Prataparudra Deva's uncle Tirumala commanded Udayagiri. His grip on the country was secured through local chieftains and temple networks, all of which owed allegiance to Cuttack. Now, this was not a kingdom that could be defeated by a simple single attack. This would mean a grinding war of sieges. And so in the first months of 1513, Krishnadeva set out for Udayagiri. Now, the fortress of Udayagiri that we have gone over before rose on a granite hill in what is now Nellore district. The stone walls of the fort, to which the Vijayanagaras would have contributed substantively, ran along hard-to-hack ridges. Access routes were narrow, hemmed in by these cliffs and slopes. Now the Gajapatis were confident that it could never be taken. But Krishnadeva prepared for the long haul. The siege of Udayagiri began in 1513, and it stretched out for a year and a half. Such a campaign required immense organization. Siege trenches had to be dug and maintained. Wooden towers and scaling ladders were built by carpenters who traveled with the army. Battering rams and early cannons were hauled into position by elephants. Lines of supply had to carry rice, fodder, timber, and metal from deep inside Vijayanagara territory. At this point, I would like to remind you of Saluva Timmarasa or Timmarasu, whom Krishnadeva reverentially called Appaji. He was the man who pretended to have blinded Krishnadeva and then elevated him to the throne. He was the man who made the all-too-powerful Nayakas of the kingdom give up large parts of their armies to strengthen that of Krishnadeva's. So cherished was he that Krishnadeva, in an unprecedented move, made Timmarasu sit right next to him on the royal elephant in the procession. Timmarasu was the king's minister, he was the king's mentor, and he was the king's pillar of trust. His reputation was such that Portuguese observers later described him as almost a co-ruler, a man who ensured that Krishnadeva's will was carried out in practice. Now, to make his authority visible, Krishnadeva entrusted Udayagiri itself to Timmarasu's son, Kondamarasu. Once the fort was taken, it would be his. It was a reward for loyalty and a guarantee also that such a conquest would be firmly held for Vijayanagara because it was all in the family. Now, a war campaign is no small matter. The army itself was a vast city in motion. Soldiers would be accompanied by their families, traders, blacksmiths, ironsmiths, all smithies, and Brahmins who would perform rituals. Markets would spring up around the camps. Disease was a constant threat in the hot, crowded encampments. Grain had to be brought there and then rationed. Chroniclers later described that Krishnadeva himself oversaw the distribution of the food, making sure that the common soldier and camp follower were never abandoned. When the Battle of Udayagiri started, the defenders inside the fort resisted fiercely. Krishnadeva's strategy was not an all-out attack, but a siege. This meant camping outside the fort, surrounding it, cutting off all supplies to the fort in an effort to flush the troops out once their rations had run out. The Gajapati troops had stockpiled provisions inside the fort, but such a long siege, the blockade gradually wore them down. Whenever sorties were attempted to break through, Vijayanagara troops would drive them right back inside the fort. This stalemate dragged on for month after month until hunger and illness began to corrode the garrison's will. Portuguese accounts, written few years later, noted that the artillery was already a part of Vijayanagara's arsenal by this time. It is entirely possible that cannons that Vijayanagara had acquired from the Portuguese at Goa were used at Udayagiri, battering the walls, keeping the defenders under pressure. Months later, the breaking point came. This was on the 9th of June, 1514. On that day, Vijayanagara troops forced their way inside and Udayagiri fell. Tirumala Rautaraya Gajapati was captured, along with the royal aunt of the Gajapati king. Both were sent to Vijayanagara under guard. Krishnadeva not only spared their lives, but treated them with honor. To execute them would have been easy, but sparing them would announce to the world that he could be ruthless and magnanimous. Once the lands were his, Krishnadeva appointed Saluva Timmarasu's son Kondamarasu as the governor of Udayagiri. Now, this ensured that the important fort was not only held by a trusted commander, but none less than Appaji's son. This way, he created bonds of loyalty and cemented the political settlement of the siege. The fall of Udayagiri was a turning point. For the Gajapatis, it was humiliation. One of their strongest bastions was now lost. For Vijayanagara allies, it was proof that their new king, new enough, could do what earlier kings had failed to achieve. The countryside bore scars of the campaign. Villages around the hill had been stripped of cattle and grain. Irrigation tanks had been diverted to feed Vijayanagara trenches and camps during the siege. In modern warfare, this would be the work of sappers. and farmers had been forced into service as porters and laborers. Archaeological remains, ruins, and abandoned settlements still bear witness to the intensity of the fighting of those days gone by. When news of Udayagiri's fall reached Cuttack, Prataparudradeva must have realized that this war was no longer about raids or minor skirmishes. His uncle and aunt were prisoners now, his great fort had fallen, and his southern flank was now an open gash. This had all the trappings of the end of things to come. But for Krishnadeva, it was the beginning of things to come. With Udayagiri secured, the road now led to Kondavidu, which was the Gajapati's southern headquarters and the key stronghold from which several surrounding fortresses were centrally administered. And through Kondavidu lay the Krishna Godavari Delta. And this is where we take a commercial break, and when we return, let's follow Krishnadeva onward to Kondavidu and Rajamandri. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back. When the Vijayanagara banners rose over Udayagiri in June 1514, Krishnadevaraya had achieved his first great victory in the war with the Gajapatis. This one battle had taken over a year. But while Udayagiri secured his southern approaches and the valuable trade routes, the heart of Andhra still remained in Gajapati's hands. So Krishnadeva had to push deeper into the hill country, break through the ring of forts that shielded the Krishna Delta. And that brings us to the next stage of the campaign, the road to Kondavidu. Now this was a formidable stronghold. It was situated on top of a rocky hill, somewhere near modern-day Guntur. Kondavidu had a layered history. It had once been the capital of the Reddy kingdom in the 14th century, a dynasty that had built tanks and temples and even literary institutions in the Telugu country. Later, it was taken by the Gajapatis of Odisha, who used it as their southern capital and bastion. The fort's ramparts commanded the countryside, and its positions helped link Andhra with the coast. Whoever controlled Kondavidu controlled the Krishna Valley. And so the battle lines were drawn. Once again, patience and planning rather than brute force were at the heart of Krishnadeva's strategy. He did not rush headlong into Kondavidu. Instead, he set about isolating it. His generals, Timmarasu and Timmarasu, moved methodically against the outlying forts. Vinukonda fell, Bellamakonda fell. At Nagarjunakonda, once a center of Buddhism and even today a home to so much Buddhist archaeology, sported a fortified hill. Now the Vijayanagara army established a presence. Each of these victories that they had was more than just a tactical step. It was a message that resistance would be crushed, loyalty rewarded, and the army unstoppable. The tightening ring around Kondavidu was like its noose, and the Gajapatis were alone and vulnerable. They were alarmed. They dispatched a large relief force. Understandably, Prataparudradeva could not afford to lose Kondavidu. Contemporary accounts, which means reports written during the time, suggest that Prataparudradeva's army was substantial. It was drawn from Orissa's heartland and reinforced with a lot of local allies. The ensuing battle with Krishnadeva's troops was fierce, but Vijayanagara's organization and resources prevailed. The Gajapati army was routed, and the defenders inside Kondavidu were left cut off. Their supplies dwindling and their hope of relief gone, Kondavidu capitulated, and by late 1515, Kondavidu had fallen. At Kondavidu also, Appaji Timmarasu's hand can be seen. It was he who orchestrated the reduction of the ring of forts Vinukonda, Bellamakonda, and Nagarjunakonda, so much that Kondavidu stood isolated before that final assault. His ability to combine patient strategy with swift execution made him indispensable. Chroniclers of Vijayanagara note that Krishnadeva relied on him not just for military campaigns, but also the rapid installation of governors, reinstallation of them, the re-establishment of tax collection, and the calming of local elites once a fort was taken. This was a significant moment. Kondavidu's fall meant that the Gajapatis had lost their anchor in central Andhra. For Vijayanagara, though, it opened the way to lower Krishna Valley. Krishnadeva secured the fort, placed it under the care of his trusted commanders, ensuring that the victory would endure just beyond the celebration of any conquest of the day. All this, and yet the job was not done. From Kondavidu, the campaign moved to Kondapalli. The Kondapalli fortress, again overlooking the Krishna River, was one of the strongest in Andhra. Its walls were built of enormous stone blocks. Historically, it had been coveted by many people, including the Bahmani kingdom. Now, whoever held Kondapalli could dominate all the movement along the river, along the road to the coast, and all the trade routes. So began the siege of Kondapalli. It lasted 3 months. In a replay of the previous strategies, Krishnadeva's army surrounded the fort, cut off supplies, mounting repeated assaults on the fort. Inside, the defenders held on. They were waiting for aid from Cuttack. They thought armies would come in, but the cavalry never arrived. Hunger and disease weakened the garrisons, and eventually they surrendered. Among the captives were a wife and a son of Prataparudradeva. Their capture carried enormous symbolic weight. The family of the Gajapati king taken into Vijayanagara custody became living proof of Gajapati vulnerability. Krishnadeva treated them with propriety, but their presence in the camp underlined the shift in power publicly. There's something else of public note that Krishnadeva did. At Kondapalli, he allowed himself a moment of uncharacteristic lack of grace and indulged in something that smacked of peevish insult. This story is told in later chronicles. After the surrender, he ordered the fort partially dismantled, and then around the fields he sowed prickly weeds. This seemingly benign and rather incomprehensible act was actually a calculated humiliation of Prataparudradeva. For years, the Gajapati ruler had taunted Krishnadeva as a Dasi Putra, the son of a whore. By sowing these prickly weeds around Kondapalli, Krishnadeva delivered what he thought was a cutting response to the insult. The weeds scarred the land. They were living proof of the defeat and disgrace, importantly, of the Gajapati king, for all the public to see. Portuguese observers like Duarte Barbosa, writing just a few years later, marveled at the scale of Vijayanagara's military machine. He noted how vast his armies were and how they could be sustained for long campaigns, and that too in difficult terrain. For Barbosa, Kondapalli and its fall would have exemplified what he called the power and order of the Vijayanagara king. The mix of magnanimity and humiliation, sparing royal prisoners but scarring the land, gave outsiders a glimpse of the sharp contrasts in Krishnadeva's rule and, importantly, in his mind. And now comes the next stage of the long campaign, and this is the advance to Rajamandri, the great town on the banks of the Godavari. Rajamandri now was not merely a military prize, it was an ancient cultural center with temples dedicated to Shiva and Vishnu and a history that reached all the way back into the eastern Chalukyas. The Godavari plain around it was rich in rice and sugarcane, and the river itself was a highway of trade. To control Rajamandri was to control the Godavari Delta. It was one of the great agrarian zones of India. Krishnadeva's army reached Rajamandri in 1515. It remained there for 6 months. Now, none of the historians, Pays, Sewell, Stein or Ramanaya, speak of a conflict or a battle, simply that the Vijayanagara forces occupied the city. Anyway, during this time, Krishnadeva reorganized revenue collection, installed loyal governors, and he made offerings at temples. These gestures were not just ceremonial, they were a statement of local legitimacy. By endowing temples and patronizing Brahmins, he signaled to the local elite that Vijayanagara was now the rightful overlord. The chronicles described how his presence drew not only soldiers but merchants, poets, pilgrims, turning Rajamandri into a stage for imperial power. Now, the occupation of Rajamandri also had a maritime dimension. The Godavari Delta's ports, such as Kakinada, connected inland markets to the Bay of Bengal's shipping lanes. By holding Rajamandri, Krishnadeva effectively secured a second coast for Vijayanagara, complementing his arrangements with the Portuguese on the west. Textiles, especially dyed cottons, could now flow outward to Southeast Asia. In economic terms, the conquest of Rajahmundry extended Vijayanagara right into the trade circuits beyond the Bay of Bengal towards the east. By the close of 1515, the map of Andhra had been transformed. Udayagiri, Kondavidu, Kondapalli and Rajahmundry were now all under Vijayanagara rule. The Gajapatis had been driven north of the Krishna river. For the first time in decades, the southern delta was firmly in the hands of Vijayanagara. These conquests reveal more than just Krishnadeva's determination. They actually revealed the machinery of his state. Appaji, Saluva Timmarasu's role as Prime Minister was central to all this. His reputation as the king's pillar was well deserved, which makes what happened to him, and I will get to that in a future episode, hard to digest. For now, when we pause at Rajahmundry, the human cost of war should not be ignored or overlooked. Each siege meant villages stripped of food and cattle. Peasants were pressed into hauling wood, digging trenches, or carrying stones, very often right into war to serve as frontline fodder. Temples were sometimes requisitioned as supply depots. For ordinary people, the passage of armies brought hardship and disruption. Yet, in the calculus of 16th century kingship, these costs were absorbed into the rhythm of war. Victory justified the suffering, apparently, and defeat would have meant even harsher reprisals, reminding us that no one but the privileged win in a war. News of these victories traveled quickly across the land. In Vijayanagara, poets and chroniclers praised Krishnadeva as the conqueror of Andhra. In the Deccan courts, the rivals took note. There was once a time when the Bahmanis had claimed overlordship of Kondapalli and Rajahmundry. Now Vijayanagara held them back, and the sultanates were all aware of this. The Gajapatis, who had projected their power deep into the south and had shown every sign of wanting to come into Vijayanagara, had now been rolled far back. At Cuttack, Prataparudradeva must have realized that the war was now existential. How could he be expected to forget that his uncle and aunt were captives? His wife and son were captives in Vijayanagara custody. His southern provinces were lost, and prickly weeds lay as a personal rebuke to him. Yet he held on to Orissa proper, and he would not concede without further struggle. Krishnadeva, meantime, could take satisfaction. In the space of 3 years, he had achieved what generations of Vijayanagara kings had failed to do. He had prized Andhra from the Gajapatis, extended his empire to the Godavari. But he was still not done. His gaze was fixed further north. He would march again, this time towards Cuttack. He needed to fulfill Saluva Narasimha's dream of restoring Vijayanagara to its former glory. And that is where we will leave this episode. In the next, we will follow Krishnadeva as he presses on against the Gajapatis, negotiates a peace at the very gates of their capital, and then turns westwards for his most famous campaign, the Siege of Raichur. All that coming up in the next episode. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.